Today I am going to show you how to follow along with the pattern and make this beautiful hat, which is the pattern of Dawn Tarswell. And it is found on Ravelry, and I will put the link in the description. This is the modified figure 8 hat. And I just want to expand it here a little bit so that you can kind of see. I chose to put a garter brim. She put a ribbed brim, which I'm sure looks beautiful as well. I just want to do something different. This is what the inside of the hat looks like, just in case you were wondering. I got this multicolored pom-pom at Michael's, along with this yarn, which is Charisma by Loops and Threads, which is also found at Michael's. And I thought it was interesting that the colors in this pom-pom match exactly to the colors of the yarn in this hat. So let's make the hat. The modified figure 8 spiral ribbed hat by Dawn Tarswell. I printed this out because it's just really difficult to show digital media on camera. You can find this on Ravelry, and I will put the link in the description. It makes a really pretty pattern. So this one calls for 48 peg, 5/8 inch gauge loom. And I want to try to make it also on a different one, but for now I'm going to follow the pattern. So I usually like doing my own patterns, but I'm going to do this one for a change because I think it's a really pretty pattern. I did it a long time ago and I don't even remember. This is really nice because she's already drawn out what it looks like. So you start with the purple, and I printed this in black and white, so I had to use a crayon and go over it. It's going to go around the second peg, back around to the front of the first peg, and then over to the third. And you're going to be doing different things with each of these pegs. These will be knit pegs, and this will be a purl peg. These will be different kinds of knits. So when you're making a pattern, the first thing you want to do is read through the entire pattern first, okay? I'm not going to go over this because I've already read through it. And so it's basically 2 different rounds, okay? And then we will start with the third round, and then these 2 rounds will repeat. Okay, before we begin, we have to do a brim. I am going to choose to do a different brim just because I like to change things up just a little bit. You can do whatever brim you wish to do. I'm going to do a garter stitch brim. So that's 1 row of knit and 1 row of purl, and I'm going to use actually a U-wrap knit because this loom tends to make a little bit looser of a brim. So if you want it to be a little more stretchy, you can certainly use the E-wrap. I'm just personally going to use the U-wrap. I'm going to do a chain cast on. You can do whatever kind of cast on you wish. I do is I go ahead and make a slip knot and put it on my anchor peg. Okay. All right, so you just want to double your yarn over, and it's going through the first and second pegs for the direction that I'm going. And all I'm going to do is put my fingers through here, bring the yarn. This is the second peg. Okay. Well, this is going through the next peg over. And I'm going to bring it here, and then I'm going to tighten it up. Okay. I'm going to tighten it up like that. Okay, then I'm going to go put it through the next 2 pegs, bring it through, see my loop here I'm bringing through, and I'm going to tighten it up. Okay, and before you do the last one, don't do your last loop yet if you have not done this yet, and meet me back, but leave 1 peg remaining without a cast on. Okay, when you get down to your last peg, see I have not casted on this peg yet, you're going to bring the working yarn around to the inside of your loom and place the last loop on that peg and then tighten it up. See why you want the yarn on the inside? Because you don't want the yarn on the outside. Because now you'll be able to, this is my peg 1, now I'm done, and I can bring my yarn here and I can start my row of purl. You're going to continue around and purl the entire row because garter stitch is 1 entire row of E-wrap, 1 row of purl, or 1 row of knit of whatever kind of knit you wish. So you're going to pull this loop off and replace it with this one, okay? All right, do your first row of purl and meet me back here. Okay, so you can choose to do an E-wrap if you want a stretchier brim. For this one, because the garter brim tends to be really stretchy anyway, especially with the E-wrap, I'm going to do a U-wrap. And so with a U-wrap, all you're doing is taking, here's my working yarn coming from my last peg, and you're just putting it like the letter U. You're just doing a half wrap, and then I'm just going to lift the yarn over the top, okay? So you just wrap it around there and lift it over the top. So I'm going to alternate a row of U-wrap, a row of purl, row of U-wrap, row of purl until I get it the length I want it. Ordinarily, I make my brims anywhere from 1.5 inches to about 2 inches, depending. Sometimes I do a really long one, but for garter stitch, usually you don't want to do more than about 2 inches. This is my first time doing this hat with a garter stitch brim, and then I'm going to end mine on the last row will be a row of knit before I start the body of the hat. Well, let's measure. We'll see how long it actually is. About 1 and maybe a little more than 1.5. Okay. We are now going on to the body of the hat. Okay. For this, we will refer to the pattern. So the pattern tells you, explains how this is going to work. Okay. Begin with the working yarn coming from the last peg of the cast on or previous round. Work as follows. Take the purple, on the purple line, take the yarn behind peg 1, bring it to the front of peg 2. Red line, take the yarn counterclockwise to the back of peg 2 and around to the front of peg 1 by going between peg 1 and peg 2. With yarn above the existing loop on peg 1, knit the peg using a traditional knit stitch, reverse of the purl. Then take the yarn behind pegs 1 and 2, bring the yarn to the front of peg 3 and purl peg 3. So while that might sound very daunting, it's actually not that difficult when you follow the diagram. Okay. Coming from the last peg of the cast on or previous round, take the yarn behind peg 1. So we're behind peg 1 here. Okay. Bring it to the front of peg 2. Now it's on the front of peg 2. Okay, take the yarn counterclockwise. I'm going counterclockwise. And around to the front of peg 1 by going in between. So I'm coming in between the 2 pegs, going back around to the front of 1. Okay, with yarn above the existing loop on peg 1, knit using traditional knit stitch. Okay, and this is where you need to know how to do your traditional knit stitch. You're going to go up underneath, grab the working yarn, pull it under. It's the reverse of a purl. Okay, and then lift this loop up and off. Okay. So then let's finish our diagram here. Take the yarn behind pegs 1 and 2. Okay, it's already kind of behind 1, so behind 2. Bring the yarn to the front of 3 and purl peg 3. Okay, so we're now, this is what we did. We did a traditional knit stitch. Brought it behind 2. This is peg 3. 1, 2, 3. And with this one, we're going to purl it, which means it's going to go below the stitch. We're going to dive down, grab our yarn, and pull this off and replace that stitch. All right, we're going to repeat that around the loom. All right, let's do this again. So this is going to be, we're going to repeat this over these 3 pegs for the entire round. Don't worry about these. We'll go back and lift these off. So here's where your working yarn is coming from. Behind peg 1, in front of peg 2, behind peg 2, in between peg 1 and 2 to the front of peg 1 to do the traditional knit stitch. Okay. The reverse of a purl. Okay. We get that done. We come behind peg 2. Again. Behind peg 2 and in front of peg 3 to purl peg 3. Okay. All right, now we're going to repeat those 3 stitches on those 3 pegs all the way around the loom. Meet me back here when you get to the last stitch. So now we are done with this first row. So now you're going to have 1 stitch on every 3rd peg. So just go around and lift off all of these loops. Just lift these loops over on each one of these pegs all the way around. One more thing I wanted to point out. On this page it says place a movable marker on peg 1. So I didn't do that, but I will do that now. If you do not have a stitch marker from the store, you can use rubber bands, or you can just take a piece of yarn that is a color that's different than what you're using and fold it in half. So I just folded this piece of yarn in half. Okay, and you can simply take it through your peg. Okay, pull the loop around, and then all you do is put these 2 through that one. Okay, and then just pull it to the center of your loom so that it's not in your way. And that right there can be your stitch marker. And when you're done and you want to switch it on the next round, all you do, all you do is pull it like that. So this is my peg 1. Okay, I'm going to put one of these little stitch markers on peg 1. Okay, and that's because your peg 1 is going to move. So if you've watched my video on making a spiral pattern, when you make a spiral pattern, your beginning peg, your peg number 1, has to continue to move 1 up or back a peg each round. Okay, because if you do, so for instance, this is a 3-stitch repeat, so it occurs over 3 pegs. So you're repeating these 3 stitches over and over around the loom. This is a 48 peg loom. 3 is evenly divisible into 48. So if you just did those 3 stitches all the way around, you would never have a spiral because the beginning peg is never going to move. In order to have a spiral, it has to keep spiraling around the loom. So hopefully that'll help you on explaining the spiral concept. Okay, so round 2. So now we're going to begin with the working yarn coming from the previous round and work as follows. Take the yarn behind peg 1 to the front of peg 2. That's exactly what we were doing. Knit the peg using a traditional knit stitch. So now we're going to knit peg 2 instead of peg 1. Take the yarn counterclockwise to the back of 2 and around to the front of 1. And then you're going to purl peg 3. So this is exactly what we were doing, except that instead of doing the traditional knit stitch on peg 1, we're going to do the traditional knit stitch on peg 2. So here's my working yarn. Here's peg 1. I have my peg marker. Okay, I'm going to go in between peg 1 and 2, wrap the front of 2, and this one will be my traditional knit stitch now. Okay, so I want to do the traditional knit stitch on peg 2. Okay, then I'm going to come in between those 2 pegs again, wrap peg 1, Bring it all the way behind peg 2 and in between 2 and 3, and then we're going to purl the third peg just like we were doing. Okay, so now I'm going to purl that stitch. Okay, do that again. So before, when we were coming back behind here and we were going in front, and in front of this one we were doing the traditional knit on this peg. All we did was swap it to this peg, okay? So working yarn is coming from here. You go behind peg 1 to the front of peg 2, and this is your traditional knit stitch. All right. Traditional knit stitch, lift it off, place it back on. Okay. Now we're going to bring it in between and back to the front of peg 1 so that we have 2 loops on peg 1. Now we're just going to come to the back of peg 2 and in between 2 and 3, and we're going to purl the third peg. Okay. And then we're going to do that all the way around the loom. Meet me back. Okay, so I came to the end and I purled this peg. So once again, every third peg, you'll have 2 loops. So simply go around and lift those loops up and over and meet me back. So when I was talking about how the pattern is the same, you're just switching which peg out of the 3 that you're doing the traditional knit stitch on. Right here on the pattern it says, end round 1, peg 2 is simply wrapped with the yarn above the existing loop, and peg 1 is a traditional knit stitch. Peg 2 will be knit at the end by lifting the bottom loop over the top loop. In round 2, it's reversed. Peg 2 is a traditional knit stitch. Peg 1 is simply wrapped. Peg 3 is always purled. So she even has a little summary on here for you to help make it a little bit easier. Having finished round 2 and after knitting off all pegs, which we just did, purl peg 1. Move the marker 1 peg to the right. This is your new peg 1. Then work rounds 1 and 2 using the new peg 1 as the starting point. Repeat these steps until the hat body's the desired length. So remember when I had told you, and this is one of the things I explained on my video, in order for a spiral to occur, you have to advance your peg 1. In this case, it's going to be 2 rounds, then advance your peg 1, 2 rounds, advance your peg 1. So we completed the 2 rounds, so we're going to move our stitch marker off of peg 1, and we're going to move it to peg 2, which will now be our peg 1. Okay, so it said to purl the first peg so that we can start here. So it said, having finished round 2 after knitting off all pegs, purl peg 1. So this is my peg 1. I'm going to purl it. Now we start our 3-stitch repeat once again. So we start back with round 1. So you can rewind the video, go back to the very beginning when we first started this pattern, where we're going to go behind. This is now our peg 1 with our marker on it. Behind peg 1 to the front of peg 2, then to the front of peg 1, and do our traditional knit stitch. Lift that stitch off, replace it, come between, this is now peg 2, this is peg 3, between pegs 2 and 3, and do your purl. All right. So then you're going to do that round, and then you're going to repeat the second round with changing your second peg to be the traditional knit stitch peg, and the first peg will have 2 loops on it. So you can rewind your video. YouTube also has a slow motion function where you can choose to be, I think, 1/4, 1/2, or 3/4 speed. So we're going to repeat those 2 rounds until the hat gets the length we want. So when you repeat, this is round 1 of the pattern. Repeat, we're going to do round 2. Then you're going to purl this peg, move your marker up 1 peg, and then it's going to keep moving up each round. That's what creates your spiral. Okay, I am at the end of round 2, and I knitted over all the pegs that had 2 loops on them. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to remove this stitch marker because our peg 1 is going to move again. Okay, so this was our peg 1. Now this one, peg 3, is going to be our peg 1. So what do we do with this peg so we can start on this one? We purl it. So at the end of round 2, you're going to purl what was your previous peg 1, and then start your round 1 of your pattern again. Okay, so we purled peg 1, and we have now advanced our marker. So we started out, this was our peg 1, we did 2 rounds, we moved it to here, we did 2 rounds, moved it to here, we're going to do those same 2 rounds. You're just going to repeat that until you get your hat the length that you want it. I usually make my hats about 8 inches. You may want to make it 8.5. And then when you get your hat the length that you want it, we will do the bind off. Okay. Once you get your hat the length that you want it, and I've got mine about the length that I want it, we're going to do the bind off. So let's see what the pattern says about the bind off. I have a video for a flat drawstring bind off, and this is going to be very similar. So it says the bind off is worked over 2 rounds, gives a flatter top. Okay, first round, take the working yarn behind any knit pegs. For the purl pegs, place the working yarn in front of the peg below the existing loop. Purl the stitch, but pull the working yarn all the way through. Okay, this is pretty similar to my flat drawstring bind off, but we're just going to use the pegs the way they are currently knitted and purled, as opposed to doing 2 rows of 2 knit, 2 purl. Second round, using the same technique as the first, purl the remaining knit pegs. Okay, and the first part of the bind off says, cut yarn leaving a tail equal to twice the circumference of the loom. So you're going to wrap your yarn. And by the way, this is my last round, first peg of my last round, and I left the stitch marker on the first peg. So in other words, we started over here, and remember each round you advanced 1, and mine ended up here. So I just ended my round as if this was my first peg. So you're not going to end here where your anchor peg is. You're going to go ahead and end back up at the end with this being your first peg. Okay. So we're going twice around. So that's 1, because that's my first peg. And then I'll go one more round one more time. And I'll cut my yarn. Okay, so this should be a long enough tail for us. So if you remember your last round, you did a knit, knit, purl, knit, knit, purl. So we're going to go behind the knit pegs, and then we're going to bring our working yarn all the way up through the purl pegs, behind the 2 knit pegs, and all the way up through the purl pegs. Do this all the way around and meet me at the end. Okay, so came to the last one, and the last one should be I bring it all the way through and purl it. So now what we're going to do is take off the purl pegs. So the ones that you pulled the yarn all the way through, which will be every third one, you're going to lift off the loom all the way around. This is exactly how I do it on my flat drawstring bind off, except we have a series of 4 pegs, 2 knits and 2 purls. This one is going to be 2 knits and 1 purl. Okay. All right, and once that is done, I want you to tighten this up as much as you can. Don't break your yarn, but go ahead and pull it until you can get most of the slack out of it, and you'll end up with kind of this little star looking pattern. Now we're going to do just the opposite. So we're bringing the yarn down in front as if to purl, and this is back to our first peg, bringing it all the way through. Number 2, bringing it all the way through. Now we're going to go behind the purl peg, okay, back to the front of the knit peg, bringing it all the way through, all the way through. Behind the, I say the purl peg, behind the empty peg, and then all the way through both of these pegs that still have stitches on them. All the way around and meet me back. This is just something that I do because Jeannie Phillips, who came up with this bind off years ago, she said she liked the bind off better. So when you get back to your first peg, even though you went through it already, I'm going to go through it one last time, okay? All right, now all we do is I always take these off last. So you're just going to go around and take the remaining pegs, lift the remaining pegs off of your loom. And I'm down to my last couple of pegs. Lift those off, and that part is done. All right, now all you have to do is gently start tightening your bind off, okay? And you're going to have, if you've seen my other video, you're going to have 2 loops. You'll have an inner loop and an outer loop. So you'll want to pull the inner loop tighter first, and I always kind of leave my fingers in here. You'll see how the yarn starts to tighten. Okay, so I want to make sure I tighten that inner loop, and then I tighten the outer loop. Okay, and this is the right side of my hat, so I'm going to need to put this through to the inside. Okay. All right, and then we are just simply going to weave in our ends, and the hat will be done. Pretty beautiful spiral figure 8. See how it moves into a spiral here? These all move across here in a spiral pattern. The modified figure 8 spiral hat with a garter stitch brim.